Okay.
All right, good evening and good morning, everyone. A big thank you to SFFI Addicts and FanFi Addicts for allowing us South Asian speculative fiction authors. I won't just call fantasy because Gautam is here with us. It's such a great opportunity for all of us to get to talk about something which is not spoken a lot about. The representation of South Asian voices in this broad genre of fantasy, which has been clamoring for listening to diverse voices. So, why don't we just start this with a bit of a Rajiv Masan coffee roundtable introduction where you guys can just let's keep it interesting. Why don't you guys introduce yourself, your latest book, and talk about if you were not an author, what would you be doing right now? So, Ronnie, could we start with you?
My name's Ronnie, and I publish under Virdi. My most recent title is The First Binding, Book 1 of Tales of Tremaine, which is a South Asian lens-focused Silk Road epic fantasy. So it follows the idea of shared storytelling mythology that's actually evolved along our real-world Silk Road, and I'm doing analogs of it in a fantasy setting with the South Asian characters, sort of commenting on how proto-mythologies evolved around the world and there's similarities between shared storytelling and tropes, but using South Asian culture to show that as my character travels along my analog of the Silk Road. And if I wasn't a writer, I would probably be still working on like muscle cars or racing cars or something with that. That's my background. I used to be a mechanic and screw around with cars. I'm the greatest disappointment to South Asians. I did not study medical, law, engineering, science, any of that. College dropout.
Great. Tashan, do you want to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm an author. I'm based in Goa. My first book, The Liar's Weave, came out in 2017. And it's based around the idea of what if birth charts are real. And birth charts are basically this piece of paper you get that looks at the stars at the moment of your birth and tells you what your future is going to look like. And I loved it. I'm Parsi, so I'm technically not meant to get a birth chart, but I got mine done when I was like 13 and I loved it. And the book kind of grew out of that idea. And my second book, Mad Sisters of Essie, is coming out with HarperCollins India in September. I don't as yet know how to describe that book. It's just a mad fantasy that I love dearly from the bottom of my heart. And if I wasn't an author, I've trained to be an author my entire life. I did literature my entire life. So I would say I would be a conductor of an orchestra that is based in zero reality. I have no sense of music and I can't play an instrument. But it's what I want, so I'm going for
After seeing the latest Kate Blanchett movie called Tar, like that's something
it.
that even I
Yeah,
want
I
to do.
loved it.
So
I mean, she's
good.
crazy,
Yeah.
but I loved it. It was
She
brilliant.
was brilliant. Yeah. Great. Gautam, do you want to take it?
Yeah, I mean, before I start, I actually have read an advance copy of the Mad Sisters of Essie, and I agree that it's both unclassifiable and very good. So you should get it when it comes
Bless
out.
you.
Yeah. So I've read both a very early beta draft and then a very altered final version.
Yeah.
I wish there were two separate books, both of which were coming out separately, but we have to just make do with unfortunately with one of them. My name's Gautam. I am an Indian spec-fic writer and editor living in Delhi. The two books I've written, I call them fantasy or science fiction, depending on the audience. And since this is like a fantasy panel, we can call them fantasy. The Wall and the Horizon, where the basic premise is that there is a city within a very high wall, surrounded by it. Nobody's gone beyond it. Nobody knows what's beyond it. And the story follows the efforts of a group of people to try and then break through, and find a way beyond the wall. It draws on, a few Indian myths as part of the storyline, and the hybrid way in which we all grew up in India, both classic fantasy, science fiction canon and Indian myths have come together. And also, this is a good time for this panel because, for me at least, because I've spent a good part of the first half of the year researching contemporary Sri Lankan SF for an essay that just came out last week. So I'm still brimming with some of those things I read for that essay, and perhaps we can talk a bit about that going forward. But thanks for having me here.
Pleasure. Aparna, you didn't say what would you do if you were not.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh yeah,
I mean, I know you're a lawyer as well, but like, apart from that,
I would be a train engine driver, because that's been always been what's fascinated me since childhood.
like Sheldon Cooper, then I like that. Well. Great, Aparna.
Yeah,
what would you
well,
be if you were not a Bollywood dancer?
I am not. about dancing, but I can't swim. It's been my lifelong dream to learn how to swim and do something on the water. So I feel like I would be like a ship's captain or a surf instructor, like just something to do with the ocean and the water. But thankfully I'm an author, because I actually know how to do writing, how to write and not how to not swim. So my book is called The Phoenix King. It comes out this August, so August 29th. It's a blend of both sci-fi and fantasy. It's about inspired by Indian myths, specifically Ma Kali and Durga Ma, and specifically talks about an assassin, an heir, and a tyrant struggle for power when an ancient prophecy threatens to destroy their world. And so it comes out. Very excited. Ronnie, thank you. Just blurb it. So thank you so much. Like we put it, I don't know if they finally updated the Amazon page to show that. I was like, yes, we're having more like blurbs come up and whatnot. So excited to be here and meet some more amazing South Asian voices.
It's amazing. So I'll go last. I'm Gourav Mohanty. I'm the author of Sons of Darkness. My book just came out 2 weeks ago, and it's a grimdark reimagination of an ancient epic Indian tale in an alternate universe. I've spoken so much about the book lately that I'm you know how release months are. Like I think all of you guys know this. It's just so overwhelming that now it's like a recitation sheet in my head that I just can't do it anymore.
Yeah.
But it's just like I'll just keep it short and say it's like Game of Thrones in India. I think that's like the most laziest explanation of the book that I can do. So it's that if I were not an author and a lawyer, I think I would be a stand-up comic. I think that's something which I'm anyway pursuing on the side. I think that's something which I really enjoy. And given that I love quoting, somehow I end up quoting controversy because of my books, I think stand-up comedy seems, in India at least, seems like a viable career option from that regard. But okay, guys, so let me just start with this discussion with a question that at any point of time, did you watch something in a movie or did you read something in a book that made you feel that, damn, this is something which is based out of a myth or a facet of Indian culture, Indian history, or South Asian, let me expand it further, South Asian history, South Asian culture, that got that bug going in you that I wish I wrote something or I wish I read something which actually capitalized on this Indian aspect rather than some Western writer capitalizing on it.
I can go first on this, and I know Ronnie, you're about to launch into it too because you're both comparative mythology nerds. But this might be controversial, but Avatar: The Last Airbender draws so much from Hinduism, the concept of avatars, the concept of Agni, and there are very few South Asian characters or South Asian coded characters in the series. And I remember when I watched it, I was like, wait, that's when Krishna talked to Arjuna. That's literally where this is coming from, And I was like, but it's Aang. Why aren't we seeing a South Asian character? Specifically, I mean, more so from the Indian mythology coming from it. And so I think that's what started the bug for delving deeper into the mythologies that have inspired so many Western works. Even though Avatar: The Last Airbender blends a lot of different South Asian and East Asian mythology, it feels like a hodgepodge where it's trying to do so much at once. It doesn't really delve deeper into some of the concepts that I wish I had learned or seen a bit more about. So I think for me, that was Avatar.
That, when they took M. Night Shyamalan to direct that movie, I thought he would get that Indian aspect. He did give the Agni characters, the fire characters, an Indian origin. Dev Patel was playing the main antagonist, but they botched that up. You're right. But I think I feel the same way about the Wheel of Time. I think Robert Jordan has borrowed so heavily from ancient Indian ethos and, be it the demons, the demonic creatures, or the concept of energy. Look, I don't know if you guys have seen Wheel of Time or read Wheel of Time. There's masculine energy and male energy, which they call Saidin and Sedar, which is directly lifted off. I won't say lifted off, but directly inspired by Shaivism and Shaktism, the kind of energy concepts. And
the concept of dualism.
Correct. So he has admitted that as well. And so even the concept of Matrix, and they accepted as well, the sisters, that the concept of Matrix is inspired from Maya, the whole idea that there's an illusion. When I saw the concept, it just got me thinking that why are they able to do something so amazing out of an ancient Indian concept, and why haven't we really captured the magic of our ancestors, so as to speak? Right, Ronnie?
Well, you already tackled one, Wheel of Time, and like I actually did a thread about this where I was breaking down like pages of all the influences. But another one for me that was big was Roger Zelazny's Amber and Chronicles of Amber Lights. Yeah, Lord of Light.
Lord of Light. I was gonna say that. Yeah.
The amount of just straight up stuff that was borrowed from Hinduism and deities and names is obviously massive. But this might get really controversial, but a lot of 90s and 2000s fantasy did. There isn't just one. When you grow up, especially as a mythology nerd, and you read that, and you get older and have access to the internet to go back and codify and look up the proof, a lot of 2000s and 90s fantasy authors borrowed from South Asian stuff because they're also building off of the previous authors who did. And they don't know the sourcing of where they got it from. And it's led to this giant like daisy chain of DNA that comes from older cultures that makes up what I guess we think of Western fantasy, but it's been removed from fantasy that, you know, comes from us and other places along the Silk Road, which is part of why I wrote the first binding. And share like similar myths that can be reinterpreted to Christianity, Greek, or South Asian, depending on what your culture basis is. And then you realize like, oh no, they belong to a lot of old cultures because they were shared.
Guys, Tashan, Gautam, did you have any such event?
No, I didn't. So I didn't have any such event because obviously growing up in India, you're surrounded. So I'm Parsi, so I'm slightly separate from Hindus. And obviously I grew up in a very different cultural setting. But obviously Mahabharata, Ramayana, all of that was very much around you. All those stories were very much around you. There was a lot of literature around you that was dealing with that and like intersecting with that. So I think for me, when I did finally start looking at literature and start looking at fantasy, what I found was missing for me was the intangibles of what it's like to be Indian. I don't know how to describe that because Indian is such a large term and intangible is also just such a vague term. But it's the quietness of the plurality with which you live. It's the way of looking, essentially. And I found fantasy was the best medium to try and capture that. And I think Vajra Chandrasekhara says something about this in the note he wrote for The Saint of Bright Doors, where he says, I'm trying to talk about truths that are not facts. So just talk about a reality of a world that can't be captured in the physical reality that we understand and in the tangibles that we understand, or even in the past in terms of fact and in history. And so I think my grappling with fantasy in South Asian and how it intersects is how can we use this prism to deepen what we understand of the present and of reality and engage with it in a way in which it hasn't been engaged with before. Not before in literature, but just before in general, and in a more authentic way. So for me, that was what was really interesting and really attractive. And I think The Wall does that, doesn't it, Gautam? Where it kind of, I think it's fantasy. I know people call it science fiction, but I'm just going to call it fantasy. I think The Wall does that, and that's what I loved about The Wall, where it says, hey, these are our lived realities. I'm just going to very carefully lift them, put them in an unrecognizable setting, and then just kind of make them come alive so you can live those intangibles with me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of the whole thing of that hybrid thing where you grow up internalizing a lot of Indian myths simply by a process of osmosis, and then they become part of what you write because you've just grown up with them, and so when those references are just there with you. I think Lord of Light is definitely one of the examples. I think it's interesting because Zelazny is pretty clear that he wants to write a book where Buddhist and the Hindu and the Buddhist canon are there, and he's not he's not trying to do it subtly or indirectly. He's very clear. This is what I want to do. I think that's one book that I found interesting in that regard, and also, of course, with its flaws. And I love Zelazny. I think he's a great writer. I think the book that annoyed me was River of Gods, Ian MacDonald. That is like it's a book set in maybe a medium-term future India, which has been Balkanized, and there are water wars and all kinds of things going on. And as a premise, I mean, of course, Balkanization and water wars are both, possible lines of future that you can write interesting things about in the spec-fic context. But I think you just betrayed all the assumptions that a writer based in the global north brings to portraying a country in the global south. Many lazy assumptions about the economy, about hierarchies, about society that makes you want to issue some kind of a corrective in the same medium, which is fiction. So I think that was the book that bugged me quite a bit.
Yeah, that's interesting. I did not know about River of Gods. River of Gods, is that the correct name? Right?
Yeah, it was published in 2004, and it's
Okay.
a well-written book by a good writer. Except that there's so many slipshod assumptions about Indian society and fault lines in India that's what annoys you.
Right. That's fair. Okay, great. So, from moving on from there, I just want to actually direct this question to Ronnie and Aparna because you guys are based in America, and just from the context of South Asian fantasy, is there anything that you perceived in your journey of publishing which you felt that the traditional white authors, and I'm using the word white under quotes, did not face? Is that something which you guys went through in a publishing journey that you think, like, I don't know, any kind of discrimination or some kind of challenge, or maybe a ease of access because you are creating this separate thing that, okay, you are using, the BIPOC card? Is that something which helped you or it did not help you? Is that something which you would like to share on?
I don't know if you want to go first. I'm trying to think how to politically say this properly. Avoid drama. So I don't know if you want to go first.
No, bring on the drama, it's fine.
Bring on the controversy.
This is Coffee with Karan, okay? This is Zen footage with Gaurav. So let's
Coffee with Karan, okay.
I would say I try to keep a good look. I am at my heart an optimist, so I try not to let these things get to me. But I think it was very clear just from the onset of when people started doing, or even looking back on like publishing paid me, realizing how varied different deals can be. There was this one particular author who I will not name, who got, as the Whisper Network said, I think about like a really significant deal, upwards of like maybe like $500,000 range.
Oh, I know.
And it was a retelling of a Greek myth. And which we see, like, those books sell like crazy, even though there's so many of them. And I totally understand the need to hear diverse voices saying that, but this was a white author contributing to the Greek space. Once again, we've seen that happen so many times, versus I know a Indian author who did a retelling of an Indian myth. Different treatment. And I am not writing a retelling of Indian myths. I was inspired by them, but this book definitely takes inspiration. You'll see different threads of it, but it's not a retelling. It's like it's a totally secondary world that takes inspiration and roots from it. But my treatment on terms of like how publishing paid me is very different than a white fantasy author would get. So I think that to me is the clearest differentiation. And just like how you get paid, how marketing spend is put behind you. I think one interesting way that people don't realize, I do a lot of marketing on TikTok, which Gaurav and Ronnie know a lot about. And there's this thing called, there's the algorithm bias of putting white faces and propelling videos by white creators more over people of color. And that's because, and I've read different articles about it, of how the algorithm was created by humans, and we as humans have biases of what we deem as more watchable. And people who were lighter skin tone. So it's not just like, people who are white and blonde, but it's also people who are white passing, who are lighter skin color. So there's colorism that comes into it, where those videos are pushed out more. So like a white author, a video will be pushed out more versus my video, even though if they're posted at the same time, similar length, they might use the same music. And so to me, that's a little frustrating, but it's something that it's a bigger systematic problem, right? It's not just particular to me. I've heard from other BIPOC authors who aren't just Indian and South Asian, but from Black, Southeast Asian, and they have, faced similar treatment. And I don't quite know the solution other than we continue talking about it and raising these issues, and hopefully we demand enough and there's a change.
She said it wonderfully. Part of it is going to talk about was marketing, in that So, personal example, when my book was first coming out, it's clearly a South Asian story. Some of you have read it here, but that was the least talked about aspect of it. It was more how quickly could they compare it to an existing white fantasy. And then I want to phrase this properly because it's not a criticism or anything, but City of Brass, which we know is technically inspired by Middle Eastern culture, which is still different than South Asian. But there's this weird, if you're brown, you sort of get lumped into whatever other brown you can sort of find by publishing, which kind of defeats the purpose of let's try to give a voice to South Asian authors, because there's so much diversity in our own culture. Like, how many different languages are there in India alone? Just a different culture of how many different kingdoms have we had, different invasions, how diverse are we in our appearance? And it was really, really just weird seeing that there was such a little focus on the actual South Asianness and aspect of it, and the fact I'm sort of analoging historical myths and parts of our culture in it from a storytelling aspect, and how part of the reason, like for me, I chose to use a frame narrative is Mahabharata and like South Asia. We created the first frame narrative. That structure is South Asian inherently. And there was an article of when Asian American Pacific Islanders Month happened during the year of my release, where all they gave me was a byline saying like the first binding by R.R. Virdi, and everyone else was getting a paragraph or a page of what South or what Asian aspects they brought to the story. And I'm like, you guys couldn't even be bothered to like email me and say like, hey, we're gonna mention you here. Let's talk. Like, can you talk about the South Asian aspects about your story? So none of that happened. It was just kind of like, what's the biggest white fantasy author we can compare it to, and then what's sort of brown? Oh, City of Brass. Okay, it's that. And I'm like, you guys could have just emailed me. I would have been happy to write it for y'all. So that was really interesting dealing with this with publishing. There was very little regard. There was some interest in like we would love to have something South Asian, and then it seems like very little care and caring about the actual South Asian aspects and talking about it.
I want to add, and
go on.
I was just going to say, I took a screenshot and I still have it. I don't know if I can share my screen. And I think I sent it to Gourav and Ronnie, where I went on Google and I said Indian adult fantasy book or Indian fantasy book. And there was only one book written by an Indian author. They showed me N.K. Jemisin. I haven't looked at the screenshot. And The Kingdom of Gods by N.K. Jemisin. The Bruising of Kilwa. The Empire of Gold, The Inadequate Hair, who is by Daniel L. Jensen, not South Asian. And the only one that's South Asian is Upon a Burning Throne by Ashok Banker.
Wow.
And that's like
crazy.
It's crazy to me, where I'm like, we're trying really hard to push our stories forward, but it's like, even when we do, we're like lumped in like, okay, you guys are all brown, so go for it.
Yeah. I was actually trying to. Oh, go ahead.
It's very interesting because I was going to branch out to Tashan and Gautam about the troubles which Indians faced. Like as Indian authors residing in India, and when I was listening to the struggles that you guys have faced, I'm sorry, I just couldn't help but get reminded. I don't know that Tashan and Gautam, you might know this very epic scene where Siddharth, I don't know, the new actor in Gully Boy, Siddharth Malhotra, I'm not sure. No, what's his name? Something, Siddharth. And Ananya Pandey was sitting, and Ananya Pandey spoke about her troubles. And Siddharth said something very nice, that where your struggles begin is where our dreams come true. And honestly, because when you, like as an Indian fantasy author, the infrastructure issues that we have, let alone those issues of, racism, comparison, discrimination, etc. We don't have an infrastructure. Like when I was reaching out, this is my personal experience that I faced. When I reached out to publishers, the whole idea of a thick book, like a Game of Thrones book is easily 700 pages. And my book around was 500 pages. They would not take that gambit. They're like, no, we won't. India is not a place for SFF, science fiction, or for that matter, epic fantasy. It's something which we don't know. And from my understanding of history, it comes from a bit of a colonial perspective, where Britain placed a lot of focus on Greek mythology as classics and something to be, where if you're educated, you're a classy fellow. But when it came to Indian myths and Indian folklore, it was something which we worship as heathens and snake charmers. So our pride and our magic went away. And that's why I think Amish's Immortals the Meluha became such a hit, because it whittled away the magic in our system and kind of tried to give a science fiction explanation to everything magical that was in our lore. It's just my reading of it. Because, for example, Aparna spoke about TikTok. I don't know, Tashan and Gautam, if you know this, like book talk successes are a huge thing when it comes to publishing market. And TikTok is banned in India. I keep ranting about this. I'm like, it's not there. It's a big medium is not available. Secondly, the publishing industry taking a bet. Like when my marketing tagline of my book is India's first grim dark epic fantasy, and I realizing that wow, it's awesome that I'm probably the first, but it's too late in the coming. It's 2023. Grimdark is already a very established genre before, So it's the kind of struggles that we are trying to break through. Like, okay, I'll give you another example, and I'm sorry if I'm reaching, because again I was doing some background research. In India, we don't focus on the concept of Goodreads. Like for example, The Wall.
That's probably a good thing.
True, but it kind of shows that how the reader-author atmosphere is not very integrated. And I'll give you an example. Let's say Gautam's The Wall. Okay, it has received like absolutely glowing reviews from every literary site. But when it comes to the number of ratings or reviews on Goodreads, for example, his book does not come up in the algorithm. Same goes for Tashan's book. Same goes for my book. And this is something which I wrote about as well. Like and I'll come to this in a bit when I'm discussing what exactly is South Asian fantasy. Ronnie and Aparna both spoke about that, how they get clubbed together, with Indian, as in other authors. Now, is this something which you guys have felt, that where you get clubbed with authors of Indian origin from other countries, which does that, because I don't know, Tashan, you have gallivanted between London and India, if whatever stalking on Google has revealed.
It's true, it's correct. It's good stalking.
Great, awesome, brilliant. So Gautam and I've been based in India. Gautam, I hope I'm right. I mean, you're like a Delhi Supreme Court champ.
I've been Delhi, but I've been abroad for studying, but yeah. Delhi,
fair.
Yeah.
He was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. He's been abroad and then he went for his postdoc to Germany.
Very long time ago.
I spent my time in Germany as well. But okay, we'll definitely come to that. But what I meant to ask was that but both of you got Indian publishers, correct? Like HarperCollins India and
Absolutely,
India, right? So was that some difference that you felt when you were comparing in terms of this aspect? Like, were your struggles a lot more pronounced, or was it the same as any other author you might have interacted with of Indian origin outside?
You want to go first? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I just went for it. But if you want to go first, I'm more than.
Go for it.
I'm still sort of reeling from the algorithm on TikTok because I'm like, if we're on Book Talk, surely it should allow us access. I think I haven't broken into the Western market, so I can't compare with any sort of intelligent knowledge. But I can say that what I struggle with most right now is comp titles. Being able to just write what I want to write and have that appreciated for what it is, because there's no comp title that does either my identity justice or what I'm writing justice. So there becomes this question of what box do you sit in and what you're allowed to write. And I mean, I can't say without a longer career, but right now from where I'm sitting, it does feel very much like you have a lot more permission to be wilder and be a bit more free if you come from a certain background or with a certain basis. And I should make this very clear that as an Indian publishing in India, my journey for publishing in India has been relatively smooth, which means I'm automatically speaking from a place of immense privilege, right? Because your books are out there and you get to go to the West and say, hey, this has been published here, this has been looked at, this has been awarded prizes, all of those things. But it doesn't make a difference. Whatever happens in the East happens in the East, and it's like it's separate, quiet little black box, and it doesn't really affect the West. So I think what I'm finding hardest right now is comp titles. How do you position yourself to be allowed to write what you want to write? And those barriers are very high. And I imagine they're high for you as well, Aparna, and like Virdi. I can't imagine that's not something you'll face as well, but maybe it feels particularly a little bit more difficult because it's harder to form community in Goa than it would be in the US, for example. Gautam, take it away.
Perhaps a couple of things. I mean, I think most of the things have been said, and in particular, the absence of infrastructure, which is, the absence of conventions, the absence of flourishing sort of reading culture in terms of genre reading culture, the absence of, say, infrastructure in terms of agents and specific imprints, right? So we don't have science fiction imprints of the major publishers in India as we do abroad. So that, of course, is one issue, and that the Indian publishers lack the resources to to even place a book in a bookshop abroad, right? So forget the marketing and all of that is one thing, but if your book isn't even on a shelf, in a genre shelf in a bookshop, people can't even accidentally chance upon it and be hooked by the blurb, right? So that's a thing. So again, I agree with Tashan. I perhaps wouldn't call it a struggle, because just the ability to navigate the Indian market is a function of class, caste, urban, and all of that. It'd be a relative thing, not so much a struggle. I think the point that I think I want to make is that so I'm part of this magazine, Strange Horizons, and we've done a special issue on Palestinian spec-fic a couple of years ago, and the editor for that, Rasha Abdul Hadi, the Palestinian American themselves, had made the point that that it shouldn't be that that every Palestinian spec-fic writer needs to write something that is identifiably or distinctively Palestinian, but that a Palestinian spec-fic writer should be able to write a Deep Space Nine spin-off, and that should be equally valid. So I think one thing I've noticed is that the expectation is that the Americans and the Brits can basically tackle the sort of the universal themes, of first contact, of hyperspace and time paradoxes. So R.K.D. Martin's Memory Called Empire, right, which is a book I think it's very, very good. That kind of a book, right? That kind of like taking the big broad themes of historical science fiction. Whereas if you're like an Indian writer, then it'll be something that will be recognizably Indian in terms of, say, a myth or something localized or particular, right? But as an Indian writer, you can't write the Deep Space Nine. So I think that is one thing that I found annoying, and the expectation that you must exhibit your Indianness.
Yeah, that's really well said.
Those themes,
that's
type of thing.
I think true freedom.
So sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think true freedom as a writer is being able to write whatever you want without you being trapped by your identity, right? Because Indianness, or who we are, it takes multiple forms, so many plural forms of what we want to do, and it becomes hard then to navigate a book industry that wants you to look, your work to look in a certain way as defined by the white gaze, and I think that's just difficult.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially if you grow up
building on the things which you spoke about, Gautam, like in the sense that how we are, required to always exhibit Indianness. So, what, according to all of you, and I'll just come to that, what exactly is South Asian fantasy for you guys? Now, I'll give you an author-wise example so that it kind of the depth of the question makes sense. Is South Asian fantasy something which has to do with the world? As in the world which you have used, or the Indianness of it, or something which you have taken from Sri Lankan lore or Indian lore? Because if that is the passing criteria, Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time is South Asian inspired. So is City of Stairs, which has like a very Indian inspired word. Or and in that case, Gautam's The Wall might not fit the criteria because it's based in the future. Sumer the name is Indian or Mesopotamian, or but it does not have in that sense the desiness, what we call conventionally desi. Or does it depend on the nationality of the author, wherein someone who is residing in South Asia should be called a South Asian author rather than authors who are not in South Asia? Because when you're trying to classify them as one, you're trying to associate that identity with them, which would then exclude Aparna or Ronnie from the definition of South Asian authors because they're not based in South Asia, right? Or they are, I don't know if you guys I think Ronnie's wiki says he's American. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I was born and raised here. Yeah.
Right.
I was born in Rajasthan, so I'm actually first generation.
But this gets into the whole divide over that too, because I've had my South Asianness questioned, even though my parents literally came from India, right? So when I was born, they actually spoke Hindi and Punjabi at home. I didn't learn English actually as my first language until I was put into Montessori, which is like a preschool. Like you get to daycare where you are taught English and stuff before you actually go to preschool. So I actually grew up speaking Hindi and Punjabi at home because that's what my parents, that was their way to be safe at home. Dad goes out to work in a very American environment, new country, fresh off the boat. And at home, romance is with your wife. It's Hindi and Punjabi, and that's closest. And that's, of course, what the baby's going to learn.
But the concept of nationality comes in question, because I know Gautam will obviously can correct me here because he's like the authority on this thing. But when it comes to citizenship, India does not recognize dual citizenship. I'm just giving you like a legal example.
Well,
So
doesn't it?
No, it doesn't.
You have to give it up.
OCI. Yeah. Well.
Yeah, you can be OCI.
We have OCI cards. Yeah, we have OCI.
Yeah. So because my parents had to give up citizenship to become naturalized here.
Yeah.
Right. So in that case, now what happens then? And let's say even if you forget that, like Ronnie's book is a Silk Route fantasy. So it covers just not South Asia, it covers North Asia for that matter. I'm sure in the second book he plans to even head to Egypt,
Middle East, analogs.
Yeah.
Correct. So in that sense, he transcends that as well. So what, according to each of you, is South Asian fantasy? Is that something that should be localized to the region from where you are writing, or should it depend on the worlds which are inspired, which Gautam said that kind of annoys him? Is there some other definition we have, or you want to keep it very fluid at where everyone can come in or where everyone can go out?
To me, and I'll tackle this, and this might be reductive or too simple of a statement, but I think any work written by someone of the South Asian diaspora, whether they're from India, across India, living in different countries, constitutes as South Asian. Simply because I think the identity is not always linked to nationality. It's linked to how you grew up, what values you grew up with, what values you treasure and continue to uphold, which ones you've given away. And I think when you are a South Asian writer, some of those values are universal that we talk about. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like Indianness. Like I've had this conversation. It's funny because I was at a national convention just on Friday. We were talking about this, of what is Indianness. There's like, according to the white gaze, an Indian book has to talk about caste. It has to talk about arranged marriages. It has to talk about patriarchy and misogyny, because to them, that is what India is suffering. And it's always about suffering. And I think there's value to those books that talk about them. I think there's the Daughters of Madurai that I just read that was about female in South India, and how in certain parts of South India, and how the main character kind of deals with that in this dual narrative. And I thought it was really beautifully written, and it tackled those heavy topics. But a grimdark fantasy written by Gourav, or The Wall by Gautam, is still just as South Asian. And it's considered, to me, South Asian sci-fi or fantasy as something that's so apparently about Indianness, which is the caste system, or whatever different traditions. I think it's detrimental to pigeonhole one definition of what is South Asian SFF. Because
I'm sorry to cut you up on that, because actually there I will slightly differ from you, because for example, I saw, let's say, one of your stories where you said that your book is the first Indian fantasy sci-fi fantasy, right? But according to what we have seen in India, it's probably The Wall by Gautam, which is the first science fiction fantasy Indian. Right. So how do you tackle this? Because when we're talking about Indianness, now I know Gautam's book has been so difficult to classify by everyone. Whether some people call it fantasy, some people call it sci-fi, and most call it hybrid. And Gautam, you may correct me if I'm wrong. I think Tashan called it fantasy, right? And I thought it looked definitely sci-fi to me. So it
has the sci-fi feel, yeah.
Great. Yeah. So in that case, so that's why I'm calling it hybrid. So Aparna, here when you say, let's say we are using, now as we just spoke about it, there are infrastructure difficulties which we as Indian authors have, which American authors might not have. But when we use the lines like, Indian book, do you think that kind of steps into the struggles of local authors who might be facing a very different kind of trouble than American Indian authors? I'm trying to talk about that. So it might be called like Indian fantasy or DC fantasy. But when you call it an Indian book, when it is not by an Indian publisher, do you think that troubles? Because here is where I slightly disagree from you. That when you can call it inspired fantasy, but when you call it an Indian book, I feel that we fall into a grey line.
I think that it really hinges on that conversation of people born and raised in India versus the Indian diaspora. And that itself is a very thorny issue. And I think it's unfair to tell someone of the diaspora, you're not Indian enough because you didn't grow up in India. I think their struggles are very different. You know, if living in India, you might have one set of struggles, but that doesn't mean someone of the diaspora also doesn't struggle.
Absolutely.
You know, like I feel like it's its own set of, it's a different flavor. Everyone's still struggling, and everyone's still groping with this identity of like what it means to be Indian. And I think that, and we're talking about Indianness. That, you know, we're not even tackling the rest of the South Asian diaspora, you know, of Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan, Nepal, you know. So I think as storytellers, we make this effort to empathize with the characters we write, with the stories we want to explore, by creating narratives where the reader can empathize as well. And I think in order to create that empathy, we also have to open ourselves up to these discussions and break away these barriers of like, this is exactly what, you know, Sri Lankan fantasy looks like, or this is exactly what Indian fantasy looks like. Because as storytellers, we're constantly reinventing the wheel. We're constantly adapting. We're constantly evolving. So I don't think it's quite fair to say like, this is only what can be classified as such. Does that kind of make sense?
No, I was not saying that yours should not be classified. I was talking about like if it's called the first Indian book, that's what I was going in that direction. But you know, Aparna, I was completely like on with you on this. I don't know if you others know this or not, because I keep getting tagged on the stupid comments. So Aparna has received some, you know, criticism plus trolls that her characters, on the naming of it, it's such a trivial thing which would escape everyone. But I think Aparna, you have gone through this, that her characters are named Yasin, right? And
Yasin, Alina, and Leo. And it's really interesting that you bring these up, because I was at a national conference on Friday, and someone asked me, the interviewer asked me, a journalist asked me, like, you know, you've come with this criticism of like, you're writing an Indian inspired fantasy and you don't have quote unquote traditional Indian names like Aparna. And I pushed back saying that, you know, Indianness is not just contributed by the name. It's one of the facets, but it goes so much deeper. And I kid you not, someone came up to me afterwards, this one wonderful Indian student whose name is Liana. Her brother's name is Christopher. They're both Hindu. And they're like, thank you, because I have had this struggle my entire I am not Indian because my name is not traditional. My parents named me such because these names were personal to them. And I think that itself is worthy and valuable. Does that...
No, and I know that not only makes so much sense, and not just because you're in America. I'm sure Tashan would have seen this, because Goa has a lot of Portuguese culture. So you have a lot of Indians who do not have quintessential traditional long Sanskrit names. You know, you might have a George, very much an Indian. Does not mean that just because he has what we might perceive as an Anglo-Indian name or a Christian name is something they do not deserve to have their stories told. So I'm completely with you on that. That the whole idea of names is just, I think trolls sometimes just want to troll. I get some of them does come from a legitimate space of asking a question as to what was your reason behind it. But that was amazing. And I'm sorry, I think we have hogged a lot of the guys. Please, I hope we have not branched out too much. But Gautam, Tashan, Ronnie, if you have something.
No, I wanted to just point out, Ronnie said that he grew up speaking Hindi and Punjabi at home. English is my first language. I've lived my whole life in Bombay, and I've only ever spoken English. I did terribly in Hindi. I'm not a languages person at all. I'm horrible at Marathi. I'm consistently made fun of. So I think, to me, I think there's a lot of value in asking ourselves if South Asian fantasy is actually useful to us as writers, or just useful as a marketing term. What ontological stance are you taking? And if you're just talking about what you create, then I don't think that term has any sort of value. I mean, it's great because I get to be friends with Gautam, and I get to meet Aparna, I get to meet Ronnie, and we get to meet up at some point, and there's a huge community. But I don't actually think it has any sort of value, because the very act of trying to pin it down to a definition, I think, sort of takes away the freedom I think we're all fighting really hard for plurality and expression and whatever we want to do with our works. But yeah, that's all.
I think Oscar Wilde put it so beautifully: to define is to limit.
Yeah, gorgeous. Exactly that. Yeah.
Well, I would also like posit the idea. Well, look at how publishing treats it. We talked about this earlier, but how many Greek and Norse retellings are actually done by Greek and Norse authors? It's actually become a huge thing with Twitter, where there are Greek authors now trying to break out the Greek retelling, but it was done by an author who's technically English. Like, there are 200 years of living in England, their whole family, like they're like, yeah, we really like Circe, or we really like this one legend, or we're doing this, Greek retelling over and over and over again. It's like, well, you kind of also took that now from Greek authors who that's actually their culture. Like, they're not gone. They still exist. Greece still exists. Same with Norse legends. A lot of them are being done by British authors. It's kind of like cultures co-opt other cultures, and then they profit and they'll use it for so long that I don't know how comfortable I feel defining it for South Asians right now, because we don't even have the breadth of our work out there in the largest markets, right? Which, if we're going to be honest, like the largest markets are the Western markets. It's like the United States. I believe after that it's actually Germany, not the UK, that has a larger reader base, and at least for sales, and then it's England. And our works haven't proliferated there enough to have that broad spread of like what's South Asian. Like, a part of the argument that I've had with my publisher and my agent is the size of my books, which we've talked about. They're extremely large. Like, book 2's draft was 450,000 words, and they're trying to cut it mostly just for print costs. But I'm like, would you have done that for a white author when you have a history of dozens of 5 to up to 10 book series that are that large, where we don't have the precedence that hopefully one day someone else will be allowed to write that showcase these myths? There seems to be a lot of cherry picking of what's expected, like Gautam said too, about the South Asianness from publishers, what's expected and how we have to deliver that, within what constraints we have to deliver that, what we have to fit and look like our books say or comment on. But going back to also what defines South Asianness, look at the history of our stories. They also tackled stuff that we've talked about where other authors get to, like Gautam said, universal themes. Like Mahabharata and Ramayana aren't just what white people would assume about casteism and things like that. They have analogs directly to the Iliad and Odyssey, which when they're talked about as epic world classics, because they talked about heroism, they talked about beautiful male bonding, brotherhood, positive masculinity, whatever you want to take from them. But there are beats that, as a comparative mythology nut, I've studied and I break down, and other academics have done that. The Odyssey, Iliad, and Ramayana and Mahabharata have exact beats that match from character to characters to structure points, because they evolved out of Proto-Indo-European stories. So why is one treated like a universal classic that people in the UK will study, they'll try to reread in Latin, that are studied in America, but others are relegated to only South Asianness when they tackle universal themes as well? And I think this kind of gets back that too, like how we reduce it or try to define this will also hurt us in a weird way, rather than us having the chance to first, I guess, expand this before we start trying to codify it as much, letting the authors have the freedom to do this wide, so we have enough books to sort of have this discussion with.
I think the simplest way I can try and pitch in is that Ronnie and I have the same Game of Thrones banners, but we are free to like arrange it on our wall as we choose to.
Yeah.
I think that's there is no fit way to like do this. He can choose Martell, Lannister, Stark. I can choose Targaryen, Lannister, and Stark. So it's just, I think it's just how we choose to like talk about it. And the fact South Asian fantasy as a whole, be diaspora, Indian, Sri Lankan, Nepal, anyone, none of us have gotten a foot in the door completely yet.
Yeah.
Once we open that door, when we come in, we might think about further stratification. But I think as a whole now we need to be a collective force to make the world turn around and listen, which the East Asian authors did. The Japanese and the Chinese authors came together and created this entire huge space for themselves, and where they are now the next big thing. And I think hopefully, we keep talking about Ronnie, Aparna, and there's another author, and we just talk about that. We're trying to be the vanguard of epic, the fantasy genre, where we're trying to get the brown voice to be heard. So I hope that the future holds some bright light for us. Gautam, do you want to say something before I just open the
couple of things? I think one, for me at least, like South Asia as a term like doesn't make sense, because okay, so you can say that India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, right, have a certain unity in the sense that there was a colonial boundary, right? And that colonial boundary then sort of split into 3 nation states. So you can say, okay, here's like a common factor that perhaps binds India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh together. But then you have Sri Lanka, then you have Nepal, then you have Bhutan, right? Then you have the Maldives, right, which no one talks about. Perhaps you have Myanmar, right? So I think that in that sense, the term doesn't make sense. There's nothing. It's not one nation state you're thinking of, even if nation states themselves are sort of arbitrary constructs. It's not even that arbitrary construct. It's something even more arbitrary. Yeah. So I'm personally. I mean, I know the term is used commonly again as a marketing label to group together what ends up being like India dominated with perhaps the odd Sri Lankan, perhaps Pakistani, sometimes Bangladesh voice as well. You have Saad Hussain from Bangladesh, of course. You have Vajrayana. Yeah. So I'm uneasy with South Asia as an umbrella term, though I understand why it's being used. On names, I mean, I think this partly makes the same point. When I was working on the wall, I had a set of names for characters, and one of my readers pointed out, beta readers, that all your names are North Indian upper caste names because you are a North Indian upper caste person, right? So therefore, the names that you would think of, for your characters are reflect the names in your immediate vicinity, and not only are they like, so even not only if you go beyond your own sort of caste set in North India where you have different names, but South India will have like a whole different range of names, right? So then obviously you start thinking, okay, like you think that you are using Indian names, but actually you're not even using Indian names, because India itself is basically as diverse, if not more, than all of Europe, right? So it is a continent. So I think even India, like even Indian SF is itself like a loaded. Like there's the whole Bengali tradition of Kalpagyan that is completely different from Anglophone Indian SF. Maharashtra has like a century-old tradition of SF. So I don't even know if Indian SF makes sense. Of course, you can say, okay, India is a nation state. So India plus Indian diaspora, at least the coherent sort of referral point. But I think that we need to interrogate these terms a lot more closely.
But actually, on that point, I would slightly disagree to say that South Asian fantasy is just a generic marketing term, because these terms, as we call it, have helped a lot of recognition reach books which would have otherwise been shadowed. The best example you can take is BIPOC. They are as diverse as they can be. Like, it's a very, very broad term, but that allowed a lot of books which would not have, come to the forefront because of such wide dominance in America. And obviously Ronnie and Aparna can shed more light on this. There are a lot of East Asian authors that who are doing so well right now is because of these terms. Of course, as you keep
I understand the utility of it. I understand the utility of it. That I'm not disputing.
So I guess in that sense it does make sense. But of course, once you start breaking it down, India itself being such a vast country, like from East, when I'm from Odisha and someone is in Maharashtra, the versions of Mahabharata that we both have are also so different. Let alone what we do. Our source material is itself very different. So I guess it just changes in that way. And again, you have the whole Southeast Asia example as well. Like, what do we incorporate? But I think these terms kind of, while they do help in the marketing bit, but I do feel that intention is very honorable to, to give them a block where, okay, hey, I want to read some South Asian inspired world. So once I click that link on Goodreads, it takes me to a list of books, and in that case, our books will come maybe in top 10. But in a normal wide dominated algorithm list, our books might just come in the 75th or 89th rank. So in that sense, these terms, I feel, in my opinion, become very helpful. So that's what my thing is. But
I'll believe it's more helpful when Barnes & Noble actually bothers to put up a South Asian Reads table.
Yeah.
That's when I've been actually lobbying for that. I'm like, you guys will do everything else, and this might get me in trouble with Barnes & Noble, but the interesting will. But this year we have a lot of, South Asian Reads coming out. Aparna's is coming out. Yours just came out. We had Kritika Rao's Surviving Sky come out, and they get micro attention. And again, it goes back to the reduction of you're South Asian, which I've always hated that, because it's like South Asia's South relevant to who? Because we're technically west of China, which is what the Journey West story is about. We're east of the Middle East, which is not. It's like, so first of all, who's categorizing this and choosing that? But South Asia has never been a monolith of culture, as everyone's just talked about, between 26 different languages, all the microclimates which lead to different foods and food styles, our mythology, because of how many different kingdoms have had some sort of influence and travel between South Asia and trade routes. It just feels weird. But like if publishing is going to use it as a marketing thing, I at least want to see them get marketing with it, not just online, which has, you know, inconsequential benefits because, you know, there's a drop off between how many people see it, how many people engage, how many buys that. I want to see it physically present in stores then, which is what the whole traditional publishing journey is about. That's what they offer, is in-store presence to help curate and shape reader expectations when they come in and see books on the shelves, rather than just cornered off alphabetically between like 90 other white authors or whatever. What is publishing doing by using this term to actually push and sell the books where they're dominant most, which is in bookstores. So I at least like to see that come out of it if they're going to keep doing, you know, your South Asian authors. Okay, great. What are you doing with that now? Like, what are you doing?
Sorry, go ahead, Ronnie.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, what I've noticed to be most beneficial for me is finding South Asians who are decision makers, or who are within the infrastructure itself to lead these decisions that help put your book out there, or get your book even published. Like, I had the wonderful opportunity to work with a South Asian editor, Priyanka Krishan, at Orbit. And I think it made a world of a difference because she understood right away some of the intricacies of the book, some of the subtleness, where I was coming from. I didn't have to explain, and I know, Ronnie, you've told me stories of this, of like why I'm doing this the certain way it's doing this, because she just got it, you know? And that's really powerful, because when you have these people, South Asians, I'm using this as an umbrella term, in positions of power, you will inevitably see more quote unquote South Asian stories come to the forefront. I was able, actually at Tyson's Corner, I did a signing back when I had self-published the book as The Boy with Fire, and it was because a South Asian employee at Barnes & Noble had heard about the book and helped me conduct a signing there. And that was because, you know, it's people of the diaspora, people across the South Asian identity, when they are in, like, it's not even just positions of power, but when they are in places that can help elevate South Asian voices, that's how we get to the forefront. I just saw, I think someone's comment just came up saying, like, part of the search problem seems to be incredible lack of coverage of South Asian books from mainstream internet press, which I agree. And recently there was like a blog article that was published on Bookish Brews, which was this review site. It's not like, you know, big stream internet review site, but a Sri Lankan reviewer made a beautiful extensive list of, like, I think, well, not extensive, but 8 to 10 South Asian books that were not just Indian, and it was across. And that, I think, like, we need people like us to raise our voices, because that's the only way we can be heard. I know we're always talking about the problems and struggles that we're facing, and I agree, but I also think we should also have a conversation about some of the solutions, which is raising our voices, making sure you're elevating other people and their books, and like creating that space for those voices to come to the forefront.
Yep. Like, absolutely agree. I think, like, collectively moving that list which you spoke of, Aparna, and, you know, you have so many other lists that, you know, be it Instagram or Twitter, there is a specialized focused list, and, you know, I end up discovering so many books that I had not heard of, you know, even though I'm operating in the same region. And when it comes to name, I had the opposite reaction. It's like, you can't make everyone happy. My names are way too Indian, you know, way too long. It's double syllable, like Satyabhama and Satyaki. You know, why are they both sounding SS? You know, and it was like, it's a way like, okay, what do I do now? You know, it's insane. I think all we can do is just write for ourselves, and, you know, because that's why almost every writer sets out to write. And, you know, if you find the reader base who'd like to read what you write, and that's just amazing. We get a bit of recognition.
I can't believe you said that, because I got that with two characters named Nisha and Nika, and I was like, would you guys do this with James? And some Jameses are Jims, and Roberts are Bobs, but not all Bobs are Roberts. And Patties are Patricias, but not all Patricias are Patricks. I was like, you guys will have dozens. And Game of Thrones does this. We actually, you and I are fans. The amount of like third Robert, whatever. And I'm like, you guys can keep all of that in track, but we have a Nika and a Nisha, and it makes you guys like get consternated in publishing. Like, do you want to help us normalize this or not? Like,
yeah, I had the same thing with Shakuni, Satyabhama, and, you know, Satyaki. I'm like, they are very different people, you know, very different character trajectories.
Yeah. And you can read the spellings are different. Like, if you're reading the book, you can read enough to go like, oh, they're spelled differently. They're different people. It should be that simple.
I think when we go for these things, I think Aparna and I are mostly happy that they get our names right. So, you know, Aparna and Gaurav.
Yeah. Oh, there's a reason I chose my initials.
Nice. So, guys, I'll just like highlight some questions which have come in the comments so that we can start answering them before we run out of time.
Oh yeah.
Okay, I think 1 second. Yeah, I think Mihir mentioned that there was also no mention of Samit Basu in that Google search. That was like,
Wow, given how long
Yeah,
it's
that's
been publishing,
crazy.
that's staggering actually. Because I just read Jinbat of Shanti Port and it was beautiful.
nice.
I'm so excited to read that.
Mihir, I think these were comments which came a little earlier. Again, see, I do not know how to operate this, so I'm glad the comments are coming now. But fine. Interesting point by Tashan. I would like Aparna and Ronnie to talk about this as well. Did they face pressure from their publishers about expectations as to what they were supposed to write?
Whew. Will I get canceled if I say this?
Go for
So
it,
with
Ronnie.
book 2, which isn't out yet, it's obviously a larger book, and there's a lot of cut it because of print costs, which is I thought what publishers were supposed to handle for us, but they want me to focus on the present day story a lot more at the cost of the backstory, which is heavily South Asian, and part of this is like I've talked about as a Silk Road inspired story, and that also deals with history of colonization and other cultures that have had influence in India. So as you've read book 1, Gourav, you'll notice that I have a culture. It's an analog of Portugal, Methania, which Portugal colonized parts of India, and there was actually a migrant slave trade. And book 1 doesn't talk about that yet, but there's a reason the Silk Road, my Silk Road, is connected to it, and there's an analog between past and present and certain events and how cultures and stories and names trade. And it kind of was shocking that I'm like, you guys want me to focus so much more on the present day, which is a foreigner in I guess a Portugal analog culture story part so much at the cost of stripping away the South Asian parts of the story. And I'm like, why do you want that when this is supposed to be how both of them come together and how, none of these countries are monoliths and they had to coexist and there are consequences and there's back and forth stuff between the frame story and the past narrative. And then there are reasons I'm doing it this way. And it was just kind of shocking. And I got back like the book's too big. That's not a valid reason for when you acquired this to me for being, we want the South Asian aspects and we want to see the storytelling and the techniques and some of the nesting stories I tell, our South Asian epics are heavy on nesting stories. They were some of the first to actually do them. And they're not superfluous in my case. And I've given my editors pages of explanations of why this nesting story exists and why it's going to come back later and why it's important. And they're like, yeah, but it's like superfluous word count. Like, it's kind of not. And why do you get to decide that when you're happy with, the present day, not South Asian aspect of the story being the majority, but then South Asianist parts are like, well, that one's not important or this isn't. It's like, do you really get to decide that? Or I don't know. It's definitely been contentious for me. And now I'm canceled. The second one of my editors or somebody sees this, but whatever.
Ronnie, you're way too successful to get cancelled. It's fine. Oh wait, successful people do get cancelled. So yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, that is the weird thing too. Book 1 did well for not being marketed as much as it was supposed to. I found out later that in my early royalties from August to December, book 1 technically out-earned in the first 4 months. But
That's awesome.
It's still being treated really weird of like, we don't know. And just it's like, okay, well, it's been a weird ride for me.
Well, Aparna, what about you? I mean, Aparna's book, for those of you guys who do not know, is the most beautiful Bollywood fantasy that you will find. Like, there's something which Aparna has invented called dupatta riz. Okay.
Oh
And
my
think-
God. Okay, I did not invent that. That was a comment.
Someone wrote that as a comment. Yes.
And
Sorry, my bad.
I think I'm just really good at like keying into like quote unquote marketing moments because I work as a full-time marketer for a tech company. Like that's what I live and breathe and do every day. And that has really helped me push my book out. But I do, like Gautam was talking about before, feel the limitations of using South Asian or Indian inspired as limitations of what I can say. Like I know it's very purposeful when I put it down because I know it's for certain markets or to meet and push my book towards a certain demographic that may have not seen themselves in the pages before. But it does not wholly represent, the story itself. But I will say, luckily, knock on wood, I haven't faced as much pressure from my publisher of taking away Indianness, of letting the book just be. And I think it really is because I have a South Asian editor who is at a big major US SFF imprint. Like Orbit is one of the biggest ones. And she is a huge and supporter for South Asian voices. Vaishnavi Patel Kaiki she's my agent sibling and editor sibling. And for those of you who read it, like that book itself has controversy around it, and yet our editor like gives us the permission and the courage to explore these, intricate topics without, instilling fear. Like she's always there to help support us, which I truly love. So I don't know, it goes back to that question of like who's in power and how can we get people like us to be decision makers. I mean, Gautam, you're part of like Strange Horizons, so you have a position of, and you were talking about raising even like Palestinian American voices or Sri Lankan voices. So you have that power, and I think that's really cool of how you're elevating, not just South Asian voices, but BIPOC voices, all across the board.
But Gautam, did you face that when you were writing The Wall? Because you brought this topic up, you were writing this beautiful futuristic world where there's a wall and, there are characters, but was there pressure from your editor to like make it more, I don't know, Desi or Indian?
Not at all. Not at all.
Nothing like that. Great.
Not at all. Because I think perhaps that's one perhaps benefit of publishing directly in India. Is that was never a thing. So I had complete freedom to do that. So there was never a thing of make this more Indian, because how much more Indian can it get? That India published in India by an Indian imprint. What's more Indian than that? So there was never that problem. Fortunately, yeah.
Tashan, not with you as well, right?
No, I feel like in India you have absolute freedom to do whatever you want, because they're just like, it's fine, it won't sell anyway, it's all okay. But I think abroad there's a lot more positioning of yourself as an Indian author, and therefore what as an Indian author you're allowed to tackle and what you're allowed to write. Yeah. At least that's what it feels like right now from where I'm sitting. Maybe that changes once I'm actually in the West and in that industry.
Of course, the caveat to what Tashan said was that if you're in India, there are a lot of things that if you write and if by some chance, it gets out, then you might be in some danger.
I face that.
That's
because
true.
I have written a grimdark reimagination of the Mahabharata, where I'm dealing with like a lot of issues which I felt were questions, and I anticipated that as a lot of trouble. Like for the longest time, my dad was asking me, "Why don't you use a pseudonym? Just in case if you get into some trouble." I'm like, nah, it's fine, it's okay, it's going to be fine. But so far, somehow it hasn't happened yet, because I feel that Mahabharata being already like morally gray and having so many different versions, it hasn't like the target audience who I felt would have had an issue with it hasn't, in fact, have ended up loving it. So far, no stone pelting on me yet, but that can change anytime here. So as we all know. Cool. I'll just read out some comments. Premi has written, Salman Rushdie also talks about the South Asian structure and the format of stories, breaking away from the traditional Western structure. So I think Ronnie already spoke about this. In your publishing journeys, what has been the most common form of the right/B South Asian expectation? What features seem most expected? I think we spoke about this already in terms of Desiness. So just like, sorry, Yudhanjaya. I think this is Ronnie, your friend, right?
Yeah. Sri Lankan author, brilliant guy. We co-wrote stuff together, and then and Gautam also knows him.
Yeah, and everyone should read the Salvage Crew. The
Salvage Crew. Yeah.
Must do. Yeah.
But this is pretty
I
amazing.
think he just won the Gratian too in Sri Lanka. So a massive literary prize over there.
Like in terms of
right. What were you saying? You were saying something.
Sorry. I was saying that in this whole right-B South Asian expectation is actually very interesting, because like I have been also fortunate like you guys that my editor has given me the complete freedom to be as I want to be. But not from my editor. Just generally, there's been a bit of pushback on my series name, which is called the Raga Vrita. I wanted like words which are very inherently Indian that do not have a translation in the Western counterpart. And Harvard has recognized that Rag is not a word that has a counterpart in Western music. And so same goes for Rita. But the whole idea of pronunciation of it is an issue. So there was some questions raised about, can I rethink the series name? And, it's like when you've thought of the name already, it has settled into your system. Changing that just feels, adultery with your book and your story. And that just like, it just did not. But so answering that question, that was his expectation, but has not been forced on. So that's a good thing. This is nice. Bo has asked, so how can we as fans help you all get the exposure you deserve outside of the obvious answer of posting reviews on all the major sites?
who buy the books, unfortunately, because at least in American publishing, it comes down to that. I don't know if I'm allowed to share this. God, if I want to get canceled, I probably already am anyways, for shit I said. But there's so much that's predetermined on your pre-orders and stuff, and publishing obviously decides your marketing. And publishing's paid me, and recent stuff has come out about this. I don't know how many people here are aware of Publishing Rodeo, which has been talking about and breaking down, publishing stuff. And Scott and Sun Yi have gotten analysts on, and recently there was a breakdown from, I forgot what kind of doctor she is, but she did the metrics of how much publishing spend decides your breakouts. And I know for a fact mine was undercut, all the stuff I was promised. And it kind of showed in my communications of communications started getting less and less up to my debut, up until the pre-order numbers came out, and thankfully fans rallied. And instantly the tone weirdly changed. Everyone was talking to me and congratulating me and talking about it because the pre-order numbers were really good. And then it turned around to, after the 4 or 5 month cycle of everyone's really happy with my sales at that time. I don't know how it's changed now, because now we're a year later. So first hardcover returns will probably have happened as the paperbacks coming out. But it's been really interesting and weird that it just unfortunately comes back down to that, regardless of what publishing says to you. What they actually do is going to be, it's down to the numbers, down to what came out of the Penguin Random House and Simon Schuster merger, where a lawyer practically admitted that unless you get a $300,000 advance, or was it above 250, they're really not going to market you that much. They're going to hope you earn back, but it's not until then. And I can prove that without, I don't want to name names, but there's an author that I'm very close with who got double my advance, and she got a lot more marketing, and her sales were about double my actual sales. So it's interesting how that correlates, double the advance, double the actual sales, copy for copy. And it was pretty damn close to ×2. And so it really does seem like it comes down to, unfortunately, the buying power. If publishers aren't marketing you, you can't really outmarket your publisher. There's been data showing that you can try, and TikTok might help, but unless you break out, it'll move the needle so small compared to what your publisher can do if they actually try. Another example is, I know a friend of mine got a Barnes & Noble speculative fiction pick, and a Macmillan rep pushed for that really hard. And the amount of volume that shifted in copies per week is staggering, getting that one effort out of your publisher to convince a bookstore to do that for you. It's mind-boggling. Got them on a bestseller list and everything, which they absolutely deserve, but it shows how much the onus is on publisher and then obviously readers. And that both those equations are out of our control. You can't make your publisher do something for you, and you can only hope you can convince your readers to buy you.
So to answer this question,
There's word of mouth is
I think that's what we just talked about.
Assuming you like the book, just talking about it with people,
Agreed,
is very, very helpful.
I mean, my book went from indie to traditional purely because of word of mouth. I was published in India by a small-time publisher, and then it got picked up by Head of Zeus and Bloomsbury simply because of pure word of mouth. But to answer this question as to how you guys can, as fans, apart from the obvious answer of obviously buying the book and reviewing it, is, I don't know, personally, I think that if you feel that you want to, I don't know, get someone the exposure, just search Afghanistan cozy fantasy novel, something which would not at any way come on the top of the algorithm, and I just think that might just unveil exciting results which you would not have come across in your normal way of things. So, and that will help you. The more you discover, the more you talk about it. And, once you start making a conscious search in that direction, maybe the internet gods will start picking up, okay, wait, hang on a second. Maybe South Asian treasures do merit more time on Google's search one result. So, and that can and so that when Aparna and we search that result, N.K. Jemisin's book doesn't come up. And, someone Nepal or Myanmar, I think that's something which I would like to add. Next question. Does anyone else want to add to this, or can I move on to the next question?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll go. We have 10 minutes, so I'll just quickly. There aren't many left. To everyone, based upon the struggles with publishers, would it cause you all to return to indie or remain, or is it the opposite where you want to push the struggles? I guess the base is indie or traditional. I'll answer this because right now it just got published, and I was indie before, and now I went traditional. I think it really depends majorly on what your other life is as well, in terms of time. Because if you have, for example, I'm a lawyer, and Gautam will second this, because our lives are 10 to 10 on a very good day, and when you are having that kind of a life, when traditional publishers pick up, it's not that your effort at marketing the book like in any way diminishes, but they do a bit more shoulder work than which you would have to do a lot more as an indie. So I guess that for me was a big load off. So personally, this is my personal experience because having been on both sides. But
I came
know
from indie.
Yeah, you came from India as well. Yeah.
And what I've seen and people I've talked to who've also done both now in our hybrid is, and again, Publishing Radio's talked about this in other places, that it seems like traditional is getting more comfortable trying to offload a lot more of the work onto the authors. Like, hey, start your own TikTok. Hey, start doing this marketing, start doing that. And again, the data suggests it doesn't move the needle as much. So I am definitely keeping my hybrid options open because I know what I can make indie. I know the support is growing. And also I've got friends doing Kickstarters, for example. And remember, the goal of publishing is to get your books into bookstores to reach readers, right? They don't do any good sitting on the shelf. They have to be sold. And Kickstarter just sells directly to your readers now. And I know what the margins are. I've seen people go through the data. And I think we're in a very interesting wild west time where more is becoming viable for authors to earn incomes now without necessarily being locked up into one publishing format. So for me, I'm just keeping all my options open because this is how I pay my bills, and I'd like to keep being able to eat.
Yeah, I was self-published before this, and it was basically, the Phoenix King was first called The Boy of Fire, and then Orbit acquired it, and now it's like got a revamp. It's called The Phoenix King. And I did not a Kickstarter, but it was an Indiegogo, and that's like another crowdfunding campaign site. And we raised it. The data suggests that it takes about $6,000 to publish one book. Just like in terms of like copy editors, layout editors, developmental editors, your regular editor, cover design, cover artists, all of that. NetGalley, like when you're self-published, you have to pay for your book to be up on NetGalley, which I didn't know until I had to do it. And so there's all these costs. And like Ronnie says, I firsthand was able, like we raised about, I think a little over $7,000. So I did have some like leeway. And my books, they were at $39 for a paperback, which was quite a steep price point, but it was like you got a signed copy, pure swag, and your book was in the acknowledgments of the book, so you were listed as like one of the original crowdfunding raisers. And so I was able to see firsthand grassroots efforts to help a book get published. And I was a small scale. The biggest scale was Brandon Sanderson, who did like amazing millions of dollars. Like, and that's what we all want to strive for. But I think it, like Ronnie said, it's becoming more of a viable option if you know how to market, if you know how to do outreach. It's definitely doable.
Well, that's
I think
interesting.
how to is the very operative portion, because I ended up Gautam, I spent my Shadil Amarchand bonus on my cover art when I started out.
It was good amount of money, I would imagine.
I had to. It was the UK designer, and I really wanted to do my cover, and the cover is great, luckily. But
there's something I want to bring up though.
Sorry.
There's something I want to bring up. I realize that affects POC authors and gets back into this as well. So some of you might have recently seen that Barnes & Nobles and publishers are dropping mass market paperbacks, and the loss of hardcover debuts for especially POC authors. And I think we've talked about this in our private Discord. Part of the reason my book performed so well in terms of earning is because it debuted in hardcover, like the margin costs that they get back. But I'm also seeing that with the loss of hardcover and the print prices we're seeing raising, traditional trade paperbacks are coming out right now, because I'm Googling searching this right now, are now just as high or higher than indie trade market paperbacks. So the traditional cost of what a paperback to a reader is also increasing. So that's actually going to affect the market. If a traditional publisher can no longer put out a paperback cheaper than what a KDP, I'm going to use KDP as an example because they have their own printing, KDP paperback, that changes the market a lot. Because part of it was the mass market.
Absolutely not make sense for a lot of Indians, because for us, hardback is like the last golden Nobel Prize that you get,
right?
Because hardbacks are generally, which go, and Gautam and Tashan, you might correct me if I'm wrong, mostly non-fiction, right? I rarely ever see a fiction book in hardback. I don't think I've seen one in the longest time. Hardback is like the ultimate prize that you do get. But literary
fiction in India.
Literary fiction gets a lot of hardbacks. The Lies Weave was hardback. But Mad Sisters.
It's not turned into like a profit mechanism. Where outside India, and this is something which I saw from Ronnie and everyone else's experience, they start out with hardbacks and they earn so much money for them. and
Yeah.
like make up for any kind of thing which they lose in paperback. And it's interesting. Like in India,
Yeah.
my book is like a 500 bucks, 600 bucks, something like that. And a lot of people are saying that's too expensive. And like, it is 600 pages. It's like, 1 rupee per page. That's okay. But
Yeah.
then I get the whole, I don't know, we were used to Vikram Seth novels, which were like around 1500 pages. And after Chetan Bhagat's books, I don't know, I don't know, has that collective reading capacity gone on? I'm not quite sure. But it's interesting. But we are at a good crossroads there. So, yeah. What is Publishing Rodeo, by the way?
So it is a podcast run by Sunyi Dean and Scott Drakeford, who are also two tour authors who debuted with me last year. And all three of us have had very different experiences in our release and marketing and promises. And Sunyi and Scott created a podcast about it because they're on both extremes. Scott's book was acquired for a certain amount, and I think he's talked about this. It's okay for me to say, but it was kind of just thrown at the wall like spaghetti. He wasn't given arcs. He wasn't really given the support he felt like he could have gotten. And Sun Yi's book got a lot of love, and it was treated wonderfully, and it is a great book. And they both just had very different results. And they started talking about first their experience in interviewing other authors. Myself and Wayne, who is an author from Singapore, if I remember correctly, originally. We talked about our experiences. They bring people on who have had other deals. They cover a lot. It's a fantastic podcast. Everything from marketing, budgeting, promises, monetary stuff. I believe Preemi, who commented and said publishing Virdi, I believe she's been on. They talk about a lot of stuff. It's kind of like SFF Addicts, but it's only publishing professionals coming on talking about the industry and some harsh truths, because if you're in a debut group, there are a lot of new authors or aspiring authors seeing it, and it's, I guess, depressing some of them when they see some publishing truths come out of how the industry's run, at least in the West.
Yeah, it's a good podcast. It's worth listening to.
Great. All right, guys, we are coming to the close of this session, and it was like so many amazing discussions that we have had from the different range definition of South Asian fantasy to the struggles which we all have faced, to the need for not having a definition, and to just talk about everything else that we spoke about. Now I've even forgotten the list of what we have spoken about. But any parting words that you guys have before we close the session? Tashan, we can start with you, if that's okay.
Oh, I just wanted to say it was really lovely chat. My eyes are slightly glazing over. It's near midnight at this point.
Yeah, like I want a Cinderella away.
But it's honestly been fantastic. It's been a great conversation. It's been lovely hearing different perspectives. And I actually really love when we talk about South Asian fantasy and kind of explore what it is to be creators of that, and kind of step away from those definitions, kind of step into the reality and the meat of it. So I had a great time. Thank you so much for having me here.
Great.
She said everything so beautifully. Yeah, like this was fantastic hearing everyone's perspectives and just talking. And obviously, meeting more South Asians is always just great, because it's like you said, we're kind of a fractured community in terms of publishing at times because of the gap between where we publish from and time, and we haven't had our books codified as much and shared on shelves. So hopefully this is the start of that, and helping to make that same movement you talked about, analoging East Asians and other groups that have gotten to break out and establish themselves that way.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to SFF Addicts and FanFiAddict for hosting this and giving us a space to talk about it. All the questions were great. All the discussions were great. And go get everyone's books. Please buy our books so we can continue conversations like
Keep writing, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and echoing everyone, and thanks to Gaurav for moderating. For taking
Thank you. I was just writing, why is no one thanking me?
Thanks, Gaurav.
You know how difficult it was to get all these questions and to stalk each one of you to find these questions.
Thank you. Thank you, and this was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. And I really had a great time chatting and learning from you all so much. For people who are watching this, Ronnie has written the first binding. The book came out last year. It's doing amazing. As you know, he's already out on his stuff. Tashan's book, The Liar's Weave, something with these bird charts. I want to buy it. I can't wait to read it. Gautam's book, which is unclassifiable, apparently. Yet The Wall, I think it's just something amazing. You guys, please need to dig into it. Aparna's book, The Phoenix King, please imagine Shah Rukh Khan and Deepika Padukone in that book. So that book comes out in August. So just look out for it. My book, Sons of Darkness, just came out 2 weeks back. The best way to support us is obviously buy the books and leave the reviews. But even if just word of mouth will help. So thank you everyone for listening, and good night, guys. Cheers. Or since we're South Asians, namaste.
Bye, guys. Thank you.